Late afternoon sunlight slipped through the tall glass windows of the Grand Maple Hotel, painting the marble lobby in soft gold. The place gleamed with quiet luxury. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above, polished floors reflected designer luggage wheels, and the scent of fresh lilies drifted through the air from a vase taller than most of the guests who passed by. People moved with purpose, business travelers glued to their phones, families balancing excitement and exhaustion, influencers angling for the perfect photograph beneath the chandelier. In the middle of this flowing, well-dressed crowd, she stepped in. The elderly woman paused just inside the revolving doors as though the air itself had changed. Her coat was thin for the season, the wool worn smooth at the elbows. Her shoes had once been black, now faded to a tired gray. A small handbag hung from her wrist, the kind given away decades ago at department store counters. Her hair, carefully combed back, carried the soft silver of long years lived quietly. She stood there for a moment, adjusting to the brightness, to the hum of conversation, to the quiet music playing somewhere unseen. She did not look lost. She looked determined, but the determination trembled like a flame in a draft. At the reception desk, 3 staff members worked behind sleek monitors. Their uniforms were crisp, their smiles practiced. They welcomed guests with names already displayed on screens, handed over keycards, explained breakfast hours in voices trained to sound warm without being personal. One of them noticed her. The glance lasted less than a second. It slid from her shoes to her coat to her small bag. The smile that had just been bright for a man in a tailored suit dimmed into something neutral, almost blank. The staff member turned back to the screen, fingers moving faster as if suddenly very busy. The woman began the slow walk toward the counter. Her steps were careful, not weak, but measured. She seemed to carry something heavier than her bag, perhaps memories, perhaps the weight of walking into places where she no longer felt she belonged. Guests flowed around her, a river parting briefly around a stone, then closing again. She reached the desk and waited. No one looked up. Keycards slid across the counter for others, credit cards tapped against machines. A bellhop laughed politely at something a guest said. The woman stood just to the side, hands folded over the handle of her purse, posture straight, eyes moving from one staff member to another. She was not invisible. She was simply not chosen. Seconds stretched, then a minute. The music seemed louder in the silence around her. She shifted her weight slightly, the small movement of someone trying not to take up space. Finally, she lifted her hand just a little, a polite signal learned in a time when people waited to be invited to speak. One receptionist glanced up, eyes passing over her like a window reflection, then looked right through her to the man stepping up behind, whose watch alone probably cost more than the woman's entire wardrobe. The receptionist's smile returned instantly, bright as the chandelier light. The woman lowered her hand. Her eyes did not harden, they did not plead. They simply held a quiet understanding, the kind formed after many small moments just like this one. Moments when the world measured worth in fabric, in shine, in how new something looked. She waited a little longer. A couple brushed past her, their perfume sharp in the air. Someone's suitcase wheel clipped her heel, but the apology was tossed over a shoulder without a glance back. She steadied herself, one hand briefly touching the counter, fingers tracing the cold, perfect edge of the marble. At last, a young trainee at the far end of the desk noticed her. His badge still looked too large for his jacket, his posture too straight, as if he was still memorizing how to stand. He opened his mouth, about to step forward. Before he could, his supervisor leaned closer, whispering something without looking at the woman. The trainee hesitated. His eyes flicked between the older staff member and the woman, training over instinct one. He turned back to his screen. The woman's gaze dropped to the floor where the marble reflected blurred shapes of moving legs. She seemed to gather herself as though bracing against a cold wind no one else could feel. After a while she nodded once to herself, a small, private decision. She turned away from the desk. Her steps back toward the doors were slower than before but not unsteady. They carried the quiet dignity of someone used to leaving before being asked to. The revolving doors spun as another group entered, laughing, dragging expensive luggage. She waited for her turn, patient even now. Behind the desk, the lobby rhythm continued unchanged. But from the corridor leading to the offices behind the reception area, a man in a dark suit stepped out, reviewing something on a tablet. His pace was quick, his expression focused. He was the kind of person staff straightened for without realizing it. As he looked up, his eyes caught the sight of the elderly woman just as she reached the revolving doors, her thin coat nearly swallowed by the glass panels. Something about the image didn't fit the polished scene. He slowed, then stopped. His gaze followed her as she stepped into the turning door, her reflection briefly multiplying in the curved glass before she disappeared toward the street outside. The man lowered the tablet slightly, a faint crease forming between his brows as though a memory long buried had just stirred. And for the first time since she entered, someone truly saw her. The lobby noise returned to its usual rhythm, unaware that something fragile had just slipped through its shining doors. Suitcases rolled, laughter echoed, and the chandelier lights continued to sparkle as though nothing meaningful had occurred. But the man standing near the corridor no longer saw the marble floors or the polished smiles. His attention remained fixed on the revolving doors, now turning for other guests, as if the glass itself had swallowed a question he could not ignore. He was the hotel's general manager, a position that required him to notice everything and feel nothing. Efficiency, presentation, revenue, those were the pillars of his daily life. Yet a strange unease settled in his chest, quiet but insistent, like a knock he could not pretend he hadn't heard. He looked toward the reception desk. The staff worked as usual, unaware of his observation. One laughed softly with a guest. Another typed quickly, posture stiff with professional energy. Nothing appeared wrong, nothing except the echo of a small figure in a thin coat walking away. He tried to return to his tablet to the occupancy reports and supplier emails, but the numbers blurred. Instead, a memory surfaced, uninvited and sharp. A different lobby, not marble. But cracked tiles, not chandeliers but flickering fluorescent lights. He was younger then, barely out of school, standing beside his mother as she clutched a worn envelope. They had entered a building not unlike this one, though far less grand, hopping for work for a chance for dignity. He remembered how she had stood tall despite her second-hand coat, how her voice had remained steady even when people looked past her. He remembered the feeling of being invisible. The present returned with a jolt. His eyes lifted again to the doors. She was gone now, probably halfway down the street, swallowed by the city's indifference. He turned sharply. His steps across the lobby were fast, controlled, but charged with something deeper than urgency. Staff members straightened as he passed, sensing the shift in his energy. He stopped at the reception desk, his presence pulling the air tight. A simple question left his lips, directed at no one and everyone, but it carried the weight of authority. Faces blinked. Eyes darted. The staff glanced at one another, confused at first, then uneasy as he described the elderly woman who had just left, the thin coat, the small bag, the silver hair. Recognition flickered, followed quickly by discomfort. Someone explained that they had been busy, another mentioned that she hadn't come directly to the counter, a third offered a careful suggestion that perhaps she wasn't a guest. Each explanation sounded thinner than the last, dissolving before it could stand. The manager listened, but his gaze drifted to the trainee at the end of the desk. The young man's expression carried something the others lacked: regret. His hands rested still on the keyboard, fingers no longer moving. The manager's jaw tightened, not in anger alone but in disappointment. Not just in them but in the culture that had formed quietly, invisibly, like dust settling on polished surfaces. He turned toward the entrance without another word. Outside, the late afternoon had cooled. The street bustled with traffic and pedestrians wrapped in coats against the wind. He stepped onto the sidewalk, eyes scanning left then right. For a moment, doubt flickered. Perhaps he was overreacting, chasing a stranger who had simply wandered in by mistake. Then he saw her. She was moving slowly along the edge of the sidewalk, one hand on the strap of her bag, the other tucked into her coat pocket. She walked with care, not weakness, navigating cracks in the pavement as though each step mattered. Relief and urgency collided in his chest. He began to walk toward her, then quickened his pace. People parted around him, surprised by the sight of a suited man moving with such purpose. As he drew closer, he noticed how small she seemed against the wide street, against the city towers rising behind her. Yet there was a quiet grace in her posture, a refusal to bend inward despite everything. He called out, his voice carried by the wind. She slowed, then turned. Her eyes met his with mild surprise, not fear. She did not recognize him, but she recognized the tone, a tone that asked her to wait, that said she mattered enough to stop for. He approached, breath slightly uneven, the cool air sharp in his lungs. Up close, he saw the fine lines on her face, the softness of her expression, the tiredness carefully hidden behind composure. For a moment, he struggled to speak, overwhelmed by a strange sense of familiarity. Not because he knew her, but because he knew what she represented: every closed door, every polite dismissal, every time dignity had to stand alone. He explained who he was, why he had come. His words carried apology, but also something more, a quiet insistence that what happened inside did not reflect what should have happened. She listened, eyes steady as though she had heard apologies before, yet something in his face seemed to reach her. Perhaps it was the lack of superiority, the absence of pity. He did not look down at her, he looked level. The city noise faded between them. Finally, she nodded, not in surrender but in cautious acceptance. She allowed him to walk beside her, back toward the hotel she had just left behind. Each step back felt heavier for him, lighter for her, as if a balance was shifting in ways neither fully understood. Behind them, the Grand Maple's glass doors waited, reflecting the sky turning deeper gold. Inside, staff members watched through the windows, uncertainty growing as they saw their manager returning, not alone, but beside the very woman they had failed to see. And as the doors opened once more, the story that had almost ended quietly on the sidewalk began to unfold into something none of them could yet imagine. When the glass doors turned again, the energy inside the Grand Maple shifted in a way no one could name, yet everyone felt. Conversations softened, movements slowed. The rhythm of the lobby, so smooth and rehearsed moments earlier, now carried a faint tremor. The manager walked beside the elderly woman, not ahead of her, not behind, but in quiet alignment. It was a small detail, but powerful. The staff behind the desk watched with carefully neutral expressions, though unease flickered in their eyes like light behind curtains. The marble floor reflected them both, polished shoes beside worn ones, tailored fabric beside faded wool. The contrast was impossible to ignore now. He guided her toward a seating area near the tall windows, where soft chairs overlooked the street. Sunlight bathed the space in warmth that the rest of the lobby, for all its luxury, somehow lacked. He gestured gently toward a chair, waiting until she was seated before taking the one opposite her. Up close, the story of her life showed in details the lobby had not cared to see before: the careful stitching on her coat where a seam had once torn, the way she held her bag close not from fear but from habit, as though protecting something precious though small. The manager signaled discreetly to a staff member for tea, not the quick, thoughtless kind served in passing, but the proper service reserved for valued guests. The staff member hurried off, movements suddenly precise. Around them, whispers moved like invisible currents. Employees pretended to work while watching through reflections in screens and polished surfaces. Something important was happening, and they knew it. The manager listened as the woman shared the reason she had come. Her voice carried the softness of age, but also the strength of someone who had once spoken loudly when life required it. She explained that she had not come seeking charity or complaint. She had come because of a letter, one she had kept folded carefully in her bag for many years. She placed it on the table between them. The envelope was old, edges softened by time. The hotel's name was printed across the top in a style long retired. His breath caught slightly. He recognized the logo from archived documents. From framed photographs in the back office showing the hotel decades ago, before renovations, before rebranding, before the world had polished away its past. She spoke of a winter long ago, colder than most, when she had worked in the laundry room of this very hotel. Back when the floors were simpler, when the staff entrance had chipped paint, when survival mattered more than presentation. She had been young then, newly widowed, with a small boy at home and bills stacked higher than hope. There had been a night when the heating failed in part of the building. Guests complained, management panicked, and staff were told to stay late to fix what they could. She had stayed not because she was ordered to, but because she knew that if the hotel lost business, she might lose her job. While carrying fresh linens through a back corridor, she had found a child, no more than 7, crying softly on the cold floor. He had wandered away from his mother's room, frightened by the dark, confused by the unfamiliar halls. Her heart had not asked about job descriptions or responsibilities. She had wrapped him in spare blankets, held his small hands between hers to warm them, and walked the hallways until they found his room. She had stayed until his mother returned from searching, until the boy's tears slowed, until fear turned back into sleep. Only later had she learned who the child was, the son of the hotel's owner at the time. Days after she had received the letter now resting on the table, a note of gratitude written not by a secretary but by the owner himself. It promised that if she ever needed help, the hotel would remember her kindness. It was not a legal document. It was a promise made in ink and sincerity in a time when words still carried weight. She had never used it. Life had moved on. The hotel changed hands. Years folded into decades. Her son grew, moved away, built a life elsewhere. She lived quietly, working until her body no longer allowed it. Recently, medical bills had begun to gather like storm clouds, and pride had wrestled with necessity. She had come not to demand, but to ask if promises still lived in places that had replaced their floors and logos. Silence settled after her story, thick and humbling. The manager's eyes had not left her face. With each word, memory aligned into something clear and undeniable. He was that boy. The corridor, the cold floor, the warmth of blankets, a gentle presence in the dark, a feeling of safety that had shaped his understanding of kindness before he even knew the word. He had never known her name, only the memory of a soft voice and steady hands. Emotion moved through him, deep and steady, not dramatic but transformative. Around them, the staff sensed the gravity even without knowing the details. They saw their manager's posture shift, the weight of authority blending with something far more human. The tea arrived, placed carefully before her, steam rising in delicate spirals. This time the staff member met her eyes. For the first time since she entered the building, she was not an inconvenience, not an afterthought, not a shadow. She was the reason a child once slept without fear. And now, in the quiet heart of the shining lobby, the truth stood undeniable. The smallest act of humanity, unnoticed by most, had shaped a life that now held the power to shape hers in return. The past had walked through the doors in a thin coat and worn shoes. And karma, patient and precise, had taken a seat at the table. The lobby no longer felt like a stage of polished appearances. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the soft music, none of it held the same authority it once had. Something older than luxury now filled the air, something heavier than policy yet lighter than pride. The manager sat still for a long moment after the woman's story settled into silence. Around them, the hotel moved carefully, as though afraid to disturb what had just been revealed. Staff members who had once measured guests by fabric and luggage now stood within earshot of a truth that quietly dismantled those judgments. The woman held her teacup in both hands, drawing warmth from it, unaware of the ripple her presence had created. She had not come seeking recognition. She had come carrying a memory, folded like the letter she had protected for years, unsure if it still mattered. But it did. More than she could know. The manager finally spoke, his voice steady but softened by emotion he did not hide. He told her who he was, not just his title, not just the position printed on office doors, but the small boy from that winter night. The child who had been afraid of dark hallways and cold air. The child who had fallen asleep wrapped in borrowed blankets, believing the world was kind because she had made it so. The words did not sound like revelation, they sounded like completion. The woman's eyes widened, not in disbelief but in quiet wonder, as though a long-ago prayer had circled back in a form she never expected. Time seemed to fold between them. The years, the changes, the distance, all dissolved into that single moment of recognition. Across the lobby, staff members watched, understanding now that they were witnessing something no training manual could teach. The manager rose, not with urgency but with decision. He walked to the reception desk, his expression no longer just professional but purposeful. The same staff who had looked past her now met his gaze with uncertainty. What followed was not anger, it was accountability. He did not humiliate, he did not raise his voice, but he spoke about dignity, not the kind displayed in marble and glass, but the kind offered freely, especially when no one important seemed to be watching. He spoke of how easily humanity is traded for efficiency, how quickly people become backgrounds in places designed to impress. He reminded them that a hotel is not built from stone but from moments, from how someone is treated when they walk through the door unsure if they belong. And today, they had almost failed the person who once kept this place standing during a winter crisis long before any of them wore the uniform. Silence followed, heavy with realization. Then he gave instructions, not symbolic gestures, not temporary kindness, but meaningful change. The hotel would cover the woman's medical expenses. A private suite would be prepared for her stay not as charity but as gratitude. Her years of service, long forgotten in old records, would be formally recognized. Her name would be added to the hotel's history wall where founders and executives were displayed, because real foundations are built by unseen hands. The staff moved quickly, but this time not out of fear, out of respect. Back in the seating area, the woman watched the lobby with quiet astonishment. She had entered expecting to leave with a polite refusal, perhaps an apology. Instead, she saw people moving with care around her, offering assistance without condescension, meeting her eyes as though seeing her for the first time. Not because she had once helped someone important, but because she had always been someone important. As evening settled outside, the lobby lights warmed, reflecting gently off the windows. Guests continued arriving, unaware of the transformation that had taken place beneath the chandeliers. But the atmosphere had changed in ways subtle and permanent. The trainee who had almost stepped forward earlier approached her with a tray, hands steady now, offering fresh tea and a small dessert prepared by the kitchen. His eyes carried an apology he didn't try to hide and a promise he didn't need to speak. She accepted with a smile that held no bitterness. Because kindness, once given, does not demand perfection in return, only growth. Later, as she was escorted toward the elevator that would take her to a suite larger than the apartment she had lived in for years, she paused and looked back at the lobby. The same marble, the same lights, yet everything felt different. The manager stood near the desk, watching not as a superior, but as someone who understood how close the world had come to repeating an old mistake. Their eyes met once more. In that silent exchange lived a truth too often forgotten. The smallest act of care can travel across decades, return through unexpected doors, and restore dignity exactly when it's needed most. The revolving doors continued turning, bringing new faces, new stories, new chances to choose humanity over assumption. And this time, the people behind the desk were watching more carefully. Because karma had not arrived with thunder. It had walked in quietly in a thin coat and worn shoes, and reminded everyone what truly keeps the lights on.